Hundreds more protesters took to the streets of Baghdad's Sadr City district on Monday, demanding new jobs and denouncing the killings of protesters.
The security forces, police and the army have been firing live rounds at protesters, as well as volleys of tear gas. Snipers have also been seen, apparently to take out individual protesters.
More than 100 people have been killed in the worst violence since the defeat of the Islamic State 2 years ago. But this was not the result of insurgency or terrorism. What started as peaceful protests last week, demanding an end to rampant corruption, unemployment, and the lack of basic services, violently shifted into clashes with security forces and armed groups. And Iraqi authorities lifted a days-long curfew and internet blackout on Saturday. Iraqi President Barham Saleh condemned the attacks on protesters.
The government and the security forces reaffirm that there have been no orders to fire at protesters.
对示威者来说，政府有没有下令开枪已经没有差别，反正他们要不是被子弹打死，也会饿死。
The protesters have been driven by a profound sense of hopelessness. The people on the streets are young, educated, and they're fed up of having a complete lack of any prospects.
I have a master's degree, but the government would not even hire me as a street sweeper. All these young people are treated unfairly.
Unemployment stood at 13% in 2017, with youth unemployment twice as high.
But Laith Kuba, an advisor to Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi, said this round of protests are leaderless and apolitical.
For the younger generation, those who went into these protests, they were all born in a period where they know nothing about Saddam Hussein. They are less concerned about sectarian or national issues. They see the world through their Facebook and through their telephones, smartphones. They see how the rest of the world is living. And their questions are very, very simple. Iraq is a rich country. Why are we in such a mess?
This movement doesn't have a leader. Look at how many we are. Look at all these young people. They're all unemployed. What else should they do? Steal? Kill?
真相是，伊拉克不是没有钱。
Iraq is the world's fifth largest oil producer, with export revenues of up to $7 billion a month. And yet, it's failed to distribute that wealth to its people. It's estimated that around $450 billion was stolen from public funds since 2004.
There have been 3 devastating wars in Iraq in the last 3 decades.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait.
The Gulf War began when Iraq's ruler, Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait, a U.S. ally. The U.S. led a coalition to retaliate with airstrikes.
Much of Saddam's artillery and tanks will be destroyed.
But they also bombed Iraq's infrastructure, including 4 hydroelectric dams, which in turn disabled the water treatment facilities that relied on electricity. A sewage treatment plant in Baghdad was also bombed, causing sewage to flow into the Tigris, poisoning the water supply for southern Iraq. This UN report said the war reduced Iraq to the pre-industrial age and that the country would face an imminent catastrophe. Then in 2003, the US returned with a full invasion of Iraq. This time they quickly toppled Saddam's regime and installed a temporary Iraqi government. But the invasion further damaged the country's infrastructure. 40% of Iraq didn't have access to clean water, and 70% of sewage systems needed repair a few months after the invasion. So the US and Iraqi governments announced a huge reconstruction plan to rebuild infrastructure. It planned to bring safe water to over 23 million people and triple Iraq's water treatment capacity. But by 2006, the program had only delivered safe drinking water to over a third of the people it intended to. And Iraq's water treatment capacity was still an eighth of the program's goal. Millions of dollars were lost because of mismanagement and corruption.
Meanwhile, in Iraq tonight, more deadly violence in what appears to be a concerted effort to spark a new civil war there.
By 2011, Iraq was still unstable when the US pulled out its remaining troops, creating a dangerous power vacuum, which was quickly filled by a violent extremist group called the Islamic State. Their tactics deepened Iraq's water crisis further. By 2018, ISIS had lost most of the territory it controlled, but the damage to Iraq's water was already done. If the country was going to recover, it had to rebuild this system, and fast. So the Iraqi government announced a massive $100 billion reconstruction effort in 2018. Deadly riots erupted in Basra. Government buildings were burned, and many called for the prime minister to resign.
نريد الماء منكم، ما نريد منكم رواتب ولا نريد منكم شيء، نريدكم تعطونا الماء، الله بلكة تعود عينا على الحيوانات ونعيش منها.
ثروة النفط، زين، فإحنا ليش هيك جاي يصير بينا؟
因为伊拉克的国际透明组织贪污指数在全球180个国家中位居第169位。
The Iraqi Commission of Integrity, which investigated corruption, found that 13 water desalination plants that had been donated to Basra in 2006 never opened. About $600 million was pledged for water projects that were never completed, and Basra's sewage network was supposed to receive a multi-million-dollar upgrade in 2014, but it was still leaking into the Shatt al-Arab in 2018.
看着残破的家园，一些老一辈的怀念起曾经的美好。
رغم من وجود نظام نظام عسكري دكتاتوري كذا بس كانت اكو ناس تشتغل كانت اكو ناس يعني تمشي يعني براحتهم ما كان هذا الوضع كله ما كانت اكو فصائل مسلحه ما كان اكو مسلح ما كان اكو بطاله ما كان اكو هجره كلها ما كانت موجوده
现在的伊拉克有将近1/4的人口活在贫穷线以下，他们的愿望不过分，就是希望有水喝，有工作做。
Now, Iraqi Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi said he was willing to respond to the protesters' demands. He promised jobs for graduates, but also said there was no magic solution for the country's problems. In response, the Iraqi government pledged to add public sector jobs and today approved a grant for employment development.
ضحايا المظاهرات من المدنيين والقوات الأمنية شهداء ويتم تعويض ذويهم وتعويض الجرحى.
It is 16 years since a Western coalition ousted Saddam Hussein. Since then, Iraq has been framed by waves of violence. They fought foreign powers, each other, the Islamic State, and now the young here just want a viable future.